In this lecture, we're going to be talking about diffusion. You've seen diffusion a lot. You may just not know that you have witnessed it, but it is around you almost every day of your life. Actually, I can guarantee it's probably around you every day of your life. Before I can talk about diffusion, though, I need to make sure that you understand one important piece. Because if you don't understand this, then diffusion isn't going to make sense, osmosis isn't going to make sense, exocytosis, endocytosis, any type of cell transport is not going to make sense. What does it mean when I say that the cell membrane, that phospholipid bilayer, is semi-permeable? With that statement, what does that mean? If you're looking at this, permeable means that things can, molecules, particles, things like that, molecules can enter and leave. Permeable means you can get through it. There are holes that I can go in and I can go out. So there's kind of like doors. If I have a door there, I can go in as long as it's unlocked. Semi means that not everything is allowed to go in. So another word to say that is that it's regulated. So a cell membrane, just like any membrane that you encounter, cell membranes regulate what particles may enter and leave the cell. In some cases, it keeps the outside world out. You don't want everything that the cell comes in contact to in an environment to be able to get into the cell. So there are some cases when a cell is going to be impermeable, where nothing is allowed to come in. But if it was like that all the time, then your cell would never be able to survive. It doesn't make everything that it needs in order to survive. So that your cell has to be semi-permeable in order to keep out what it doesn't want, but to let in the other things that it needs in order to survive. So cells are going to be semi-permeable. Now, in relation to that, you have diffusion. Diffusion you have seen every day of your life. You encounter it every day of your life. Think about Sunday mornings. If you lived at my house on a Sunday morning, I'm a Southern girl, and there is a specific thing that I always like to make, at least at some point during the weekends. Usually it's on Sundays. I love my bacon, eggs, and biscuits. I know that if I want to get my husband into the kitchen up to breakfast, all I have to do is start making bacon, and he will come running along with my dog Truman. Why is that? The answer is diffusion. If you look at this picture that I now have up on the screen, in the very first part of this, I have a beaker of water. And above it, I have a lump of sugar. If I drop that lump of sugar into the water, is it going to stay as a lump of sugar? Hopefully you're saying, well, no, of course not. The reason being, once that sugar enters the water, the sugar molecules and the water molecules start interacting, and they start bumping into each other. And it causes that lump of sugar to eventually break down. And sugar molecules keep being released from that lump of sugar. Now, when I first dropped that sugar in, all of my sugar was located in one little spot. But with this interaction from water coming, it's causing my sugar to spread out within the beaker. That's diffusion. When you start very localized, and eventually your molecules start spreading out and spreading out and spreading out until the amount of sugar that I have throughout my whole beaker is uniform. And we call that equilibrium. That's essentially what diffusion is. To give it a definition, diffusion is the movement of molecules from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. With the sugar molecules that I showed you in the picture, at first my lump of sugar started out as a lump of sugar, and it stayed very localized. This is when I say that it is at a high concentration. and those brackets mean concentration. Over here, if I drew an arrow right here, I have no sugar molecules over there. So I have a low concentration of sugar in that area. So eventually, what I want my sugar to do is eventually dissolve enough so that it will flow down its concentration gradient and go from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. You would smell that if I was making bacon. When I first start cooking it, the smell is going to be very strong around me because that's where I am cooking it. But eventually, if my husband is downstairs in his office, eventually that smell will flow down its concentration gradient. It'll go from high to low, and it'll filter its way down to him, and he'll smell bacon and come running just like Truman would. Now, eventually, what you'll see is that your sugar molecule starts to equally spread out throughout the whole beaker. When it has an equal distribution, we call this equilibrium. And that is the goal of diffusion, is to eventually reach equilibrium. Equilibrium is when the particle concentration is equal throughout. Equilibrium means equal. So the amount of sugar molecules that I have in the bottom of my beaker is the same amount of molecules of sugar that I have at the very top of my beaker of water. That's what equilibrium means. Now, in order to participate in diffusion, there's a couple of different things that you have to match up to. One thing you have to be, the molecules that are going to do this, particles must be small so that they can just cross the cell membrane by diffusion and they're good to go. If I have too big of a molecule, my cell can't just let it in through diffusion. It's got to go a different route. So you must be a small molecule in order to do this. Examples of this could be CO2, amino acids can participate in diffusion, and you also have a lot of ions that can participate in this. And with ions, I mean atoms, elements that carry a charge. They're no longer neutral. They have a positive or a negative charge depending on what they're doing. One thing I've mentioned in this lecture that I want to make sure you understand what I meant is concentration gradient. And this will be my last thing that I talk about. I can sum diffusion up really simply by just saying it's when molecules flow down their concentration gradient. I don't have to break it down into when molecules move from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. If you know what concentration gradient is, it's a way easier definition to give. And that's all that it means. When molecules move from an area of high to an area of low. So if you took that picture I drew at the beginning, if I flow down my concentration gradient, I'm going to go from this picture to that picture. I have just completed diffusion by going down my concentration gradient. When I go from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. When you get into class, we will talk about specifically why this is important to cells in a little bit more detail, and then you will be doing a diffusion lab so you can see this firsthand and experience what diffusion actually is from a visual standpoint. So, bring your notes to class, and I will see you then.